So I always wanted to go into the Army. I would have preferred after high school in June of '67 to go into the military. My parents were somewhat dead set against it. They enrolled me in Bentley. I actually never took I never filled out the application to Bentley. I never took an interview. My parents basically said, "You're going there." And I showed them. I dropped out and went home one day and told them I'd enlisted in the Army. And I actually didn't drop out of school until I made sure that the Army would take me, thinking that I might not be suitable physically.
I was commissioned as an officer. I spent my entire military service as an officer, going from second lieutenant to brigadier general.
Hi, I'm Mary Landry. I'm a retired Rear Admiral. I served in the Coast Guard from 1980 to 2011, and I served around the country.
The Marine Corps had all this bad press about, not bad press, but press about we'll make a man out of you and everything, and I kind of fed in on it, but it worked. It worked. It kind of got me away from mom and dad and motherhood apple pie and your clustered little life, and realized that you have to start to be an adult and grow up and be on your own and be able to function as an individual. So that's how I ended up in the service.
So after the Vietnam War, many of the mainline denominations like Lutherans and Methodists and Presbyterians, they stopped providing chaplains for the military because they didn't like the military. And so several decades of that meant that there was just a shortage, and the goal is to have a diverse chaplaincy to provide for the religious needs of soldiers. So the church was looking for people that were young. I was young then, and they reached out to me and said, have you thought about chaplaincy? That's how it started.
I enlisted, but during that time, this was back in 1965, they had a draft going on. And at that time, you could call the draft and see where you were on the list. And I was scheduled to go in October, so I enlisted in August.
I was assigned to the Air Force. In those days, it was Army Air Force, not United States Air Force. And I took my basic training down in Miami Beach.
This was during the Korean War in 1951 through 55. I was in the service in the Air Force.
I enlisted in the Navy, and when I went into boot camp, they told me I was chosen to go into the CB division of the United States Navy.
I was with the United States Air Force, Strategic Air Command.
I was in the Navy, and when I joined not thinking that'd be anything other than, be in the Navy part. That's the seaman part of the Navy. So I joined in 1966. I graduated from high school in 1965. So during that time, the draft was going on, and also we had the Vietnam War.
I was drafted, and then I got a draft deferment because I had an injured hand. And in the meantime, I searched around to join, so I joined the Air Force.
I have been involved in both Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom during the global war on terrorism, as well as Operation Noble Eagle.
It was an officer's basic training course at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and I was trained in guided missiles and artillery.
Graduating from the class of '67, we were right in the height of the Vietnam War, and I think most of us realized that eventually we were all going to have to fill our military obligation. So I worked for a year, and then my dad had been in World War II in the Navy, and I decided I would kind of follow in his footsteps, and decided to join the Navy in 1968.
Well, I served for 20 years, so I served all over the place. Korea, Egypt, Michigan, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia.
At that time was the peak of the Korean War. So the first thing I did, I signed up with the Army Reserve. And every 2 weeks we have to have a meeting at nighttime. So I get sick and tired of it. So after 6 months, I decided to activate. So I signed up with the Army.
There are several ways that a soldier can die. They sent me to the first one in California, out in the desert training. What do you think is out in the desert? scorpions, rattlers, and coral snakes.
And I served in the Army, the branch Army, and within the Army I was two things. I was an air defense officer, so shoot down planes and shoot down missiles, missile defense, airplane defense. And I was also what they call a foreign area officer, or a specialist in a region of the world. And my region was the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact countries, which are now Russia and Eastern Europe.
Because the airborne's the best. If you're gonna go somewhere, you want to be with the best. One of the reasons I'm still here, all the way airborne.
So I volunteered for the Navy. And they always said you'd always have a clean bed and good food. And that's true. The Marine Corps and the Army, they were a little tough, you know. But the Navy, it wasn't a bad deal to go in the Navy.
I volunteered. However, I went in during a period of time in 1966 when conscription, the draft, was a reality for young men of my age. And I competed for a spot in the Navy Officer Candidate School, and fortunately I was successful and went to Navy OCS in the summer of 1966.
I got accepted to Westfield State University, and I wanted to try and become more independent, not rely on my family quite so much to pay my way. So I thought the Army would be a good stepping stone. So I decided to enlist, and I wanted to try to become an officer and use that to pay for college. But then once I graduated basic training and my job training and I got out, I thought maybe college isn't for me. So I just withdrew, and I just decided to focus more on the just being a soldier rather than, you know, being an officer or anything.
It was a day of chaos per se, because nobody knew what was going on, and they pretty much had you in the dark. And I think as they just kept you so busy that you finally were just so fatigued when you finally get to where you were going, which was Fort Dix for me. That's where I did basic training. Yeah. And by the time you got there and you got your fatigues and whatever else, it was probably 4 o'clock in the morning, and they let you go to bed, and then pretty much got you up at 8 o'clock the next morning to round 2, and then you still had no idea what was going on. So that was haircut day.
And I can remember turning in all my belongings, and of course back then the polyester shirts, you know. So that got all shipped off, and of course, you know, you lose your hair and brand new uniforms, and you know, so then getting up early in the morning and marching off to the chow hall, and wow, you know, here we are, all, you know, new recruits, and it was kind of scary, you know. It was like, you know, what happens next, and I just remember, it's like, wow, this is going to be a long day, and it was a long day. And
when I was a little boy in the sandbox with one toy, because it was a depression back then, and I was lucky to have a toy, and about once a month a plane would fly by in those days. Now it's all, every week planes go by there, but back then I looked up, I wish I was that guy flying that plane. Boy, he is very lucky. And I stayed with that dream. I never told anyone because I thought they'd laugh at me. Here I am in the sandbox, and I want to fly a plane. So, but I kept with that dream.
My first day, when you go to Parris Island, it is an island with a long causeway, and they bring you in there at 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning. And we flew into Beaufort, and then we get on this school bus, and we drive up to the main gate, and as we're going through the main gate, the bus driver says, "You'll be sorry." And then the next words out of his mouth was, "When we pull up in front of receiving barracks, make sure you get off this bus quickly." And as we pull up in front of receiving barracks, the bus stops, and this huge black drill instructor who filled the front of the bus said, welcome to Paris Island, get off this bus. And he used some colorful language. So I opened the window, hopped out the window because he was throwing people off out the front door.
The funny story, though, is my father really was very traditional. He had 5 sons, 2 daughters. He thought it was great that the boys wanted to go to West Point. He had served in the Army himself, but he wasn't so keen on his daughter going in. He really wanted me to pursue fashion merchandising or something. And so I just kind of defied the odds and said to my father, I want to do this. And once I got through it and kept getting promoted and doing well, he was very supportive. But being a traditional father, he felt it was a woman's role to be at home and not be in the service.
So when we went into North Carolina, I mean, I'd been born, raised in Belmont. I'd never really been out of Belmont. I was going to go to the Cape or to somewhere in New England. And we got into North Carolina, and the first thing I saw was this big billboard, and it had a Ku Klux Klan member holding a cross, not a picture, and it said, "The United Klans of America welcome you to Fayetteville, North Carolina." And that, really hit home that this isn't something you just see on TV. It's real, and that was sort of scary. I felt for a lot of the African American guys that were with me, even though I hardly knew them. I felt for them. It was visibly bothering them, and me too.
You realize that they were acting in your best interest. The process in most services, the Marines and the Army specifically, is they break you down. They basically break you down. You go into conformity. You basically, there was no room for independent thought. Somebody said to do something, what have you. What it taught me is how to get up in the morning and be there on time every place I go. That'll stay with me until I die.
And I think it's important to understand what they do at Officer Candidate School or at boot camp is they break you down as an individual to try to get you to work as a team.
Only in boot camp, just that they were like hard asses, that was their job, When you go in the service, especially in the Navy or any branch of the service, you got to work as a team. And especially if you're on a ship.
Down at the airborne, you ran the oval track twice a day. And it was a 5-mile track, 2.5 miles. So you've been doing 10 miles. 5 miles in the morning, 5 miles in the afternoon. Then you did cals, and you had to run everywhere. So they would get you in condition,
When you're thrown in with 30 people you don't know from around the country, all with different backgrounds, there were a handful of women, predominantly men. You really get to know each other, and you're doing your physical fitness, and you're running, and you're having to do push-ups, and you're having to do all this stuff, and they're testing you physically, mentally, and emotionally.
In basic training, I remember when the bus pulled into. I took the train from Boston to Trenton, and then we went from Trenton to Fort Dix. And to scare you and shape you up, when the bus pulled into Fort Dix, there were the Army sergeants, and they literally, to scare you, to get you in, they literally threw you off the bus. You were getting off the bus, as I remember, and I had my stuff with me, and they grabbed the stuff out of my hand and threw the stuff away and grabbed me and pushed me. And they gave everybody sort of manhandled you, try to scare you and soften you up, into the military. So I remember that when we got off the bus, they really gave us the business as far as getting into basic training. They literally threw us off the bus and threw our gear off the bus just to make us sort of scared and make us more pliable as far as for discipline.
I asked them when we were going to get our parachute training, and they said, well, we don't give parachute training to our flight students anymore. And I said, well, gee, that means the first time I'm going to be in a parachute is if somebody shoots me down or if my plane flames out. And they said, it was a gunny sergeant, a Marine gunny sergeant was in charge of our PT. And he said, yes, sir, Mr. Williams. And so I said, well, I'm not going to do this. And because they can't make you fly. And so I dropped on request, and they reviewed my commission, and they said, if you quit doing this, you'll quit everything that you ever tried to do. And I said, well, you won't give me parachute training. And they said, what makes you think you're worthy of being a naval officer? And I said, I am a naval officer. I was commissioned by the president 6 months ago when I graduated. So then they said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd like to be on a destroyer. And because when you're in ROTC, they teach you how to navigate and how ships operate. So I went on a destroyer for 1.5 years. It was deployed in the Western Pacific, and then I volunteered to go to Vietnam because the captain had been a political warfare officer in Vietnam. And I thought I was a history graduate, political science, and I thought that would be a good thing for me to do, so I volunteered to go, and I went as a political warfare advisor.
I served in Southern California, in Seattle, in Houston, in Hawaii, in Rhode Island, in DC, North Carolina, up here in Boston. Was here for 9/11 in Boston. That was a big event in our career. And then I was down in, my last assignment was as commander of the 8th Coast Guard District. So I was responsible for a 26-state region there that included the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, and the Tennessee rivers. The river system, and then I had the panhandle of Florida over to the Texas-Mexico border, and all of the activities in the offshore oil and gas industry. So I was the district commander during the big Gulf oil spill, if you remember the Gulf oil spill. That was my responsibility.
And I was there 3 days, and they found out they sent me to the wrong place. So I had to get back on a troop train, and it was midnight, Christmas Eve, and they had all the shades drawn. You couldn't drive with lights on. So, but they had all the lights out, and all you could hear was the clickety-clack of the train wheels on the track. And I look at my watch, it's midnight, and I says, my God, what the hell am I doing here? I should be home. My mother's just about ready to serve the 7 fishes for Christmas Eve. But anyway, we get to Camp Gordon, Georgia, 4 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of a rainstorm. I get to believe that it only rained down south all the time. So we walked a mile to the barracks area, and we passed out. They woke us up for Christmas dinner. And some of them were too tired to even go to dinner, exhausted from all the traveling. But anyway, next day we started our advanced infantry training.
You know, and I noticed that I was a little bit older than some of the guys that were in. Some of the guys coming in were all 18 years old or something. I was at 20, 21, and not that that's old, you know, at the time, but I noticed that they were just somewhat really apprehensive, you know, kind of scared what was going on.
Probably my most significant interaction with that is doing death notifications. And so when a soldier dies for whatever reason, around 2007, 2008, 2009, a lot of it was war, but it also could be suicide or accidental deaths. But I've done a lot of war death notifications. So we find the person, sometimes we get help with the police, from the police in that town to locate a person. Maybe the address wasn't good or they're not home, and maybe somebody in the town knows where they might be. And so we knock on the door, there's a chaplain and there's a notifier who says the words, and there's this person that you've never met before, you don't know, and you're bringing them the worst news that anybody could receive, and that had been in the back of their mind as a worry to begin with because their loved one was going off to war.
So the toughest part of the job I had was, number one, I had to go a couple of times and tell a parent and a spouse that their son or husband had died in Vietnam. I only had to do that twice, thank God. It was a terrible, terrible experience, but I did plan a lot of military funerals, because once they were told of the casualty, then you had to go in and plan and arrange for the body to come in and everything else. So this was the toughest part of what I did when I was stationed there.
So I was in a tank maintenance outfit, and we had to go back to the beach and pick up these monstrous metal things that they had there and attach them to the tank so they would act like a plow and plow through. They were fairly good, but not really great. And of course, when we did this, the German planes, spy planes, would be seeing the torch on. So we hear a plane and we'd shut the torch off. Now sometimes the plane came over and we didn't shut the torch. We didn't shut the torch off. You know why? No, they gave us all these instructions on how to recognize this kind of an airplane, a Messerschmitt 109 and all that stuff. But in the dark, you can't tell. But we could tell because the American motor planes, they had a smooth engine. Bzzz. But the German ones were, they were not balanced, they were off-centric like. So we knew it was a German plane, and we immediately shut the lights off. When we go away, and we turn the torches back on.
And we loaded bombs 12 hours a day, 2 shifts, morning. You did 12 on, 12 off, 12 on, 12 off, 1 day off in between. Yeah. And it was amazing, the ordnance that was loaded on a daily basis, to see those B-52s take off and these sorties and then come back empty and then just load them back up again. A little bit of on B-52. A B-52 carries 128 500-pound bombs and 96 750-pound bombs, and then they have rocket pods on them. And it was just day in, day out. I mean, I just couldn't figure out where they would drop it. But you may have heard the term arc light missions.
Arc light, yeah.
Well, the arc lights are the Aurora Borealis, right? Yeah. And at night, the B-52s, as they're dropping their ordnance, it looks like the Aurora Borealis and the lighting of the skies. It's amazing. Yeah. It's amazing.
We had a field exercise, and we had M14s then, and we were out in the exercise. Remember, this is OCS, so you're still being yelled at by various folks. And the M14 for the field exercises had blank adapters in the front because the M14 needed a little blowback to recharge. It was a semi-automatic weapon. And at one point, the extractor in the bolt had jammed, and it wouldn't get the spent round casing out of the rifle. So I took it to one of the sergeants, who said, "Oh, we can go fix this." And he takes his K-bar out, a knife, and fusses around with it, and there's a little tiny, highly compressed spring in the bolt. And he's going like this, and ding! This little highly compressed spring goes out into the leaves, and we spent a couple hours looking for it. Well, okay. That thereby rendered the rifle sort of inoperable. All right, race back to the barracks, rifle inspection in 10 minutes, and I had this bolt that was all apart because the spring had gone. So out there, clean the rifle real quick, and there's the whole platoon there at attention, and this Staff Sergeant Diaz, as I mentioned, came along, and he takes everyone's rifle and he looks at it to make sure it's all clean and stuff like that, and hands it back to you. And he gets to me, and when you present the weapon, you slide the bolt back so he can go, and it's all very formalistic the way this happens. Well, he gets to me, and I'm holding the weapon, and he takes the weapon, but he notices I didn't pull the bolt back because there was no bolt in there. Well, this sort of flummoxed him because he's going, wait a minute, what happened? And it was always great, because you're sitting there at attention, or standing there at attention, and he's going, I don't know what to do now. You can see it in his head. He says, well, go to the armorer as soon as we're through. But he did say, where's the bolt? And I said, it's an envelope in my wall locker.
At Camp Fuji in Japan, and our orders to go to Busan were redlined. They canceled us from going from Japan to Korea. That's probably because the B-29s were refitted in Mountain Air Force Base in Idaho to refit it to drop leaflet canisters rather than bombs. Mm-hmm. And those B-29s were assigned to the 581st Reproduction Squadron. Mm-hmm. What do you think the symbol on the plane was?
I don't know what.
A rabbit.
Oh.
A reproduction squadron. What we did was we were in the business of, well, you might call it psychological warfare.
Most of the time I was behind an armored Humvee door, covered in Kevlar head to toe, practically. We lucked out. The mission I had where we encountered most of that stuff was we were responsible for protecting diplomats. So the few times that we got attacked, we had a very distinct mission. You went through all the motions, you did all the stuff, and for the most part, the medic, well, I just kind of sit there and wait for somebody to scream for help.
My first year in Vietnam, I was a helicopter pilot. And the second year in Vietnam, I was a bird dog pilot, small fixed-wing aircraft, reconnaissance. And the first year was probably a little more interesting, whereas we did a lot of combat assaults, bringing troops into landing zones and coming back later and picking them up. And I'm not sure what you want me to tell you. There's a lot of shooting. And, you know, there's several of my friends were killed.
The city gave up with us having to fire a shot because they knew that if they started shooting at us, we would destroy the city. Like, I don't know if you ever saw pictures of Munich after the war. There wasn't a building left standing. I mean, total destruction. You can't visualize this because you'd have to see it to believe it. But anyway, we were in a little town just east of Innsbruck. We were supposed to meet up with the Russian army when the war ended. There was a little town called Schwarz. And in Schwarz, we found a prisoner of war camp that the Germans were using. And it was stocked with all Russian people who were working in the shop that was built inside of a mountain. So it was just unbelievable. This was a big airfield there. And that was when they took a picture of me in a Messerschmitt 262, first jet plane, first jet fighter that was ever taken. Of course, it was shot down. And the way the American pilots did that is they couldn't ever catch that plane. It was too fast. So they knew our planes were coming. They would go up to a high elevation, like 30,000 feet, and when the American planes passed beneath them, they would dive down, and they would shoot, and then they would go to their airfield because they couldn't carry much fuel. And our pilots eventually learned this little trick. So what they did was they just moved left and right, let them go by, then they would follow them and shoot them down on the ground. So it's a nice tactic.
You went five battle stars. So you went down the Kwajalein, you said, and Tarawa and Iwo Jima, and did you get up to Okinawa or not?
That's why we finished up.
We finished up,
yeah. Yeah. We were there around July 4th of 1945, and got orders to go back stateside for overhaul, and be prepared for the invasion of Japan proper.
Yeah.
And ironically, on December 7th, 1941, I was in the movie theater in Rockland, Maine. And when the war ended, which was what, around the 8th or 9th of August?
Yeah, 45.
I was in the same theater. We were in the movie, we got out, and here's everybody celebrating. The Japanese had surrendered.
They had a pet cemetery at Fort Myer on the South Post. And little headstones with the dogs' names and the years they lived and the years they died. So my first detail in the Army was a report to the MP, and I know me and 3 other guys reported here with a sergeant. So the sergeant said, we got a detail here that I don't want any laughter or anything. This is very serious. What are we going to do? We're going to bury a dog down at the pet cemetery, just like you bury a human, bury a Dalmatian, big box. So the sergeant said, you better not laugh or anything. It's the colonel's dog. If we foul this up, we're going to the stockade. I'm going to the stockade. So we went through a dry run, dropping the thing and everything else. Sure enough, the box arrived with a Dalmatian. The colonel and his wife showed up. And we went through the ceremony of dropping the dog into the ground, just like you bury a human. Took the shovel, started everything, and the captain, it was a colonel, I believe, and his wife, they were crying. They had no children. So here we were burying a dog like a family member down at the pet cemetery. And we were, I don't know, kids then, we kept a straight face, because the sergeant said, if we don't keep a straight face, we're all going to the stockade. Once you mention stockade, you smarten right up.
And I was up in the DMZ, which is the line of demarcation between North and South Korea. I was on the western side of Korea in a village called Munsani. Well, all of our combat action was indirect. We lived underground in an outpost. It had, our bunks were underground, our living quarters were underground. We had a glass shield that went around, and in front of that was what was called a grenade screen. And we had what are called Navy periscopes, but they were binocular, not monocular. So every time we put those up, we could see through the glass at the North Korean side of the DMZ. And very often we would see solitary riders on horseback going across the horizon from one point to another, depending upon the time of the year. Wintertime, it averaged 20 below. So I've been out in 40 below. I've never been so cold, and I haven't recovered since.
Primary mission was the military working dogs. So we were responsible for keeping them healthy. And our secondary mission was to run regular vet clinics on bases where, you know, people who live there that were service members could bring their pets for vaccinations and heartworm checks and that kind of stuff.
Drill instructor who was giving out the assignments, you know, he was just passing them on out, didn't know what it was. And turned out I was assigned to the 2nd Marine Division in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And it turned out they made me an accountant. I was curious, so I just went up to the first sergeant one day and I said, I want out of here, I want to go to Vietnam. Well, within 72 hours, I was out of North Carolina, heading out to Camp Pendleton for some more advanced training and going on over there. You know, but when I got over there, I said, oh, this is going to be an easy gig. Well, when I got over to Okinawa, all Marines deployed to Okinawa for about a week before they went on subsequent to Vietnam. And well, at that point in time, they kind of said, well, you're going to be assigned to the 3rd Marine Division Rifle Company. I said, Rifle Company? They said, well, yeah. He says, we don't need any accountants over here.
I felt cold, miserable, ready to go to hell. It was wicked. I mean, it was muck all over. Tracks and tanks getting stuck. No gasoline to move with, you know. It was wicked. Couldn't be any worse. Couldn't be any worse. And you don't always know where you're at either. The Germans tried very hard, but one thing that was against us, the weather was bad, so the planes couldn't come over and help us. Then finally the weather did clear up, then planes came over and they helped us a lot. We were able to knock a lot of the German tanks out, but they couldn't go anywhere. They didn't have gasoline. They couldn't get it. They had no way of getting supplies of gasoline to their tanks, so they had to scrape, so to speak. Yeah. So we were lucky in that respect.
You know, the only time I've seen casualties is during the Vietnam War. I would be on aircraft that were taking bodies from Vietnam to, arriving in the United States and taking them around the United States. It was a sobering experience to be sitting there on a plane. The whole plane was full of caskets. So it was difficult.
When I came home, my parents had a big party and everything for me, but I I came in the house, I'd been out with my best friend buying some civilian clothes. And I came in and my sister and my mother were in the living room and they were just sitting there and they both were crying. And I said, "What's the matter?" And they said, "It's you." And I said, "Me? What did I do?" And they said, "You're not the same boy anymore. You're mean. You don't like to be nice to people, you get in fights." And they said, "That's not how we brought you up. We didn't bring you up to be like that." And I said, "Well, you have to remember, Mom, I've only been home for like 3 days from a war. I can't get used to the noise in the streets and things." I said, "You know, I just can't go back to being Paul McCauley that I was in 1964 till right now. It'll happen, I hope, slowly, but I can't guarantee it will. It's just you don't know if you're going to live beyond the next hour sometimes, next minute."
You know, I didn't mind seeing the Vietnamese being killed, but it really bothered me when I saw the American kids being killed. And after a while, you get pretty well hardened to it. You know, it's not a... You have to accept it or you go crazy. And you can't be worried about your safety. If you're worried about your safety, you can't do your job. So, no, I don't know what to tell you about war other than it's absolute last thing we should be getting involved in. It's, you know, it's easy for the politicians to say, "I'm going to send a couple of thousand guys." Well, that's a couple of thousand guys with a wife and kids and families, and the politicians bother me a lot when it comes to war.
About once a month, we would transit the Straits of Hormuz, which is very close to Iran, and each time the Iranian Navy would shadow us. There was also risks of suicide boats either striking us or the carrier. And that whole region, there's a lot of undiscovered underwater mines that have been left over from the Iran-Iraq conflict.
I was with a task force from Massachusetts that went down after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana in 2005. And in 2003, 2004, I was part of a joint task force that was at the detention facility in Cuba and at Guantanamo Bay. And then in 2006, most of that year, I was in the desert in Kuwait on the border with Iraq as providing support to an aviation task force and to troops that were going into Iraq or coming back from Iraq.
So what I did for the first 6 years, I was a 74 Delta, which is a hazmat. It's chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear specialist. And what that is you focus on elements of chemical warfare, defense, preventative measures, reacting to industrial accidents, chemical attacks. Back in the early 90s, I was just touching on it when Saddam Hussein was using nerve agent against the Kurds. That's when we really had a big focus on protecting our soldiers against chemical agents. I think similarly, right now in Syria, chemical weapons are being used against the local population. So our function within the military is to protect our combat assets so they can go in and do their job without having to worry about, chemical agents, that sort of thing. That's our primary duty. That's what I did. Now I recently changed jobs. I'm an intelligence analyst now.
I was over there during a very explosive time during the Vietnam War called the Tet Offensive. I just got over there the end of January, which was the beginning of their new year. The Tet year over there is their new year in Vietnam. And I was stationed out of Da Nang, that's the northern part of South Vietnam, which now it's all one country. But I was sent over there, like many other Navy people, and my particular group was called Naval Support Activity. So Naval Support Activity is a group of, they were using this particular group for supporting the troops in the field.
Vietnam, most of them had gone through the Tet Offensive in 1968, which the equivalent of that would be a Belmont policeman being in Belmont Center, and all of a sudden there's an uprising, there's shooting. I mean, you're greatly outgunned. A lot of MPs were killed, a lot of non-MPs were killed, but I was an MP, I was overseas. I went up to the DMZ twice, the demilitarized zone, which is very much in the news now, and I was an MP. I had control of the patrol area between outside of west of Seoul, east of Incheon, and a little bit north of there, and we had bars. So my only combat I saw was nightly. I would go into bars, 15 bars, and I would go in and I'd break up bar fights, arrest people. I fought, but not on the front lines, but I fought the war of Sinchon Village, of going through bars every night. Yeah.
We weren't welcomed home. And then people say, thank you for your service. Nobody has to say thank you to me. I did it because I did it. And like I said, I don't expect thank yous. I don't want them.
I have never, ever in my life wanted anybody to thank me. Like this saying now, thank you for your service. At some point, it's starting to become a little trite. It's like it's just a saying that people just. It's a feel-good saying. It's a feel-good saying. I never asked for any applause, any pat on the back, nothing. But I just sensed that there was but people were just kind of like not looking you in the eye. It was just that they just didn't. You reminded them of the horror that was going on over there.
When you came back, people weren't very happy with you. So it took me about a year and a half to figure out how to get back into the society. And so people didn't get help. And I'm not even sure that anybody knew what to do, because if you take a 23-year-old and you put them in a war zone and people are trying to kill them and then they're trying to kill other people, which I mentioned before that, I wasn't angry with the Vietnamese, and yet their government was doing to them what our government was doing to us. And in my view, the governments failed. And then they put their 18-year-olds, gave each side a rifle, and then you're supposed to shoot at each other. So that's kind of the irrationality of war once it gets there. But it's hard to come down from that. In the Civil War, what they did was they gave veterans farms. And then people, they farmed for the rest of their career. But in our case, they didn't do that.
No, to me it was a job. It was just another job that you did, and you did your 3 or 4 years, and when I got out, I got out. And it was funny. I took my uniform, and I remember the day I was discharged up in Fort Devens, and I took everything and threw it in the dumpster. That's what I did.
We were so tight, but it was because of the circumstances. We were from total different walks of life, just thrown together for a period of time that we became as close as brothers, but yet we also knew at that same time is that we were going to be breaking up and we're probably never going to see each other again.
I've made a lot of friends. I'm still friends with a lot of the guys that worked for me or worked with me. And I'm really kind of proud of that, because I was a tough sergeant, and I expected a lot from my troops, and I drove them hard, but they I guess they were all pretty cool with that, because they were still in touch. So it's a great feeling when somebody reaches out to you. Now with social media and all that, people can find you really easy. So
my military experience for me was very important. As I mentioned, I learned as supply sergeant, I learned a lot of negotiating skills. You were responsible for all of the equipment in the unit, okay? And you would give it out to people and they would sign for it and so forth. But you would always end up being short of something. One time, for example, we couldn't find a truck. couldn't find it anywhere. So we went down and we stole a truck from one of the other units. We changed all the numbers on it, and we put it in our unit for the inspection. And then, you know, they came and they stole it back. I mean, but it was a lot of manipulating. For example, you on your accounting book, you would have maybe you were supposed to have, I don't know, pick a number, 270 sleeping bags, and you had 280. Okay, you had 10 extra sleeping bags, but say you were short on blankets. Okay, and you were supposed to have 280 blankets, you only had 270. So you'd be going around saying, hey, look, I got 10 sleeping bags. Somebody give me 10 blankets. I need 10 blankets. And so you'd be trading back and forth on your excesses and shortages. So it was, and you always had to be on your toes in order to do that. It was interesting. It was fun.
I think of all of the men and women that are in the service today, that I think we have to look at them in a different light and to really be appreciative of what they're doing. They've left their families, they're putting their lives in danger, and so I think we need to look at them in a different light and really more thankful and appreciative of what they're doing.
Well, I feel I grew up. Yeah, I learned responsibility. You learn that you're a unit, you have to work together. Those things were very important to me in all my life. And yeah, and the camaraderie that we had. And like I said, everybody had their back. Everyone's back. And that's something that, you know, I don't know if you ever learn it if you're not in that situation.
People should be thoughtful and not impulsive when they join the military. They should, I tell them before they went to basic training to start running a lot, but get in shape. But it's what you do when you go in the military, and I tell this to kids in court, I've been a magistrate for 31 years, is you have to be careful when you put your life in the hands of other people. That is, other people control your fate. Okay, that you have no free will. You can go AWOL, you wind up in jail. You have free will if you want to. But there are certain positions you get in life, either in the military or outside, where you basically give up control of your physical well-being and your life to others.
I learned that there's always a different side to every story. I learned that cultures and nationalities should be respected.
You know, since I retired, and you know, I look at the various expeditions and campaigns the United States has mounted in Iraq and Afghanistan. You always ask the question, are we doing the right thing with the number of troops and the casualties we get? And so you're more, you're more thinking about this than ever before. And when you're in the military, you just react to orders. You do what you're told to do. There's not much thinking about it. When you're out, you're thinking about what happens to the young men and women who go off now, taking your place.
I feel very strongly that when we got away from the commitment to having to serve as a result of the draft, you had to make a decision. Was I going to get drafted and go away for 2 years? Was I going to enlist for 3 years or 4 years? I think the experience of being in the military, even though I was only in for 6 months essentially of active duty, is very developmental. And I think every person in the country should be required to serve in some way after high school, because it's a very, very maturing process. You learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about other people. You learn a lot about other cultures. You know, I had grown up in Belmont, and you know, back then, kids from Belmont lived a fairly privileged life, middle class, but fairly privileged life. And you know, when you're in the service, you meet people from the South. You meet people from you're very, very poor.
For the veterans that are currently serving, I understand that they do what they're told, and if the government sends them somewhere, they'll go and they'll do the best mission they can. And unfortunately, I think the United States in general looks at our soldiers in a negative way when our government sends them to do stuff that the general public doesn't agree with. And unfortunately, the soldiers, sailors and Marines and Navy guys, they all pay the price for that, and it's unfortunate. But in regards directly to what you asked me, I don't think I'm as supportive to combat missions and putting our guys in harm's way now as I was back then. But I do know that our military, our U.S. military is the greatest force on earth, and they are completely ready and willing and motivated to do whatever is called upon them. And I think it's a shame if our government orders them to do things that, you know, we all don't really support, that they're the ones that usually pay the price for that. Like Vietnam veterans, they're still very hurt about the treatment they got when they returned from Vietnam. But they were just doing what they were told because they're good soldiers. Good soldiers do what they're told. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's kind of sad that they are the ones that pay the price.
The American people, it's in the old days, they'd lose, you know, in Iwo Jima, they lost, I think, 5,000 people in that battle. But nobody ever saw it on television. Now people come home and you see people coming home in caskets, and I think it drives it home. That you shouldn't waste lives.
Having been in it, I understand that there's a lot more to it than just the idea of combat and the stuff we see in movies and all that. I personally have seen and dealt with a lot of local nationals that are destroyed by dictatorships and then destroyed by years of combat operations around them and our attempt to stabilize. We as a nation, especially being such a powerful nation with so many resources and the worldview about us and our allies, we have no choice. We have a responsibility to our fellow man, and unfortunately, bargaining doesn't always work right now. There is always going to be somebody willing to commit violence against us or somebody else in order to get what they want. So the unfortunate necessity is that we have people willing to stand up and defend those people.
We could avoid wars, but then at this particular time, in our time now, it's something that's, you know, it's not a political war, but it could turn into a political war that we have. You know, some people say it is, some people say it's not, but the impact to me is that, you know, we're always going to have them. In the situation that the U.S. is in, is that we're going to be like a governing policeman, which we shouldn't be, but it's part of what the life is. The basis of power that we are the basis of power that are going to be. So.
An awful lot of us, we hoped the result of World War II, that it would be the end of all wars.
Yeah, yeah.
And you probably see my last statement in that to that effect. And I do thank for the decision made by Harry Truman. Mm-hmm. I think he made the toughest decision that a human being had to make, and it did end the war, and it saved a lot of lives. Yeah. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that lost their lives as a result of it, but hey, war is war.